Okay, so this presentation is going to be, it's part 5 in the series, and it concerns itself with how each stage of poetic development relates to the poem in a particular way. It assigns it a particular role and function. This will we'll see where it goes from here, but this definitely does tie together a few of the threads that have been running through this series so far. What it ties together is the acronym SWEAR. So we have, which is a word that I'm going to explain why that word once I've spoken about the role of the poem in each of these stages. So, as I said, we've got, as I've already explained a few times, sentimental, scholars, censors, scryers. Each have a different type of poetry. They each have a different level of knowing or a different material they work with, and they have a different purpose. Okay? What I'm going to add now is the role of the poem. So, the sentimentals types of poets are trying to create essentially a record. And this record is what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to play on the connotations of selfie or snapshot, which is what Geoffrey Hill thought that self-expressive poetry was, and which he disliked, but I think that's what I'm trying to pick up on. It is essentially a record of self-related emotions, personal emotions. What we get next is the relic, and that's what the scholars create. And the connotation I'm trying to carry with this is a couple of different things. One is the artifact, which is an external, almost an idol, that is distinct from one self. So it's not a record in the same way. It's not a record in the way that the sentimental poem is. The other connotation I'm trying to pick up with relic is essentially a sacred artifact, because it is whereas a record is something that is a little bit more distant. It speaks of potentially significant events from a distance, and it maybe doesn't put you in touch with it as directly as a relic does. And so what I'm trying to show is that there is, over these two stages, a movement towards a more immediate relationship with what is sacred. This continues into the next one, into the next two. So the censors have a different role. They assign the poem the role of something like a ritual communion, which is something I've actually written a fair bit about in my own poems on this Substack. So what I'm trying to indicate there is that the poem is that which, if the reader is to receive and absorb it into the structures of their being, both enlarges them in the way that anything nutritious does. It helps the growth of the being, that's food, but it also, and this is the function it has in the Christian sort of mass, it is the bridge into the wider life. of that Christ spoke about. And there's a double function going on there with the communion. It's in my last presentation, when I was talking about appropriation, the purpose that censors have for their poetry, I spoke about the difference between a really honest conversation you have with someone and the difference between that and the kind of conversation that you might have with someone who has some wisdom for you to absorb and grow into. Both conversations are necessary. The honest conversation is probably analogous to the record or to the affirmation that the sentimentals are trying to create. And that is still a needed function because we live in a very artificial society, and where honesty is rare and therefore has value. But I would say far rarer is wisdom, and the kind of wisdom that's put within almost our zone of proximal development in a way that we can absorb and grow from thereby. Because I think the censor looks out at society and sees that majority of it is composed either of sentimental people who are being honest all the time, about things they probably don't need to be, possibly, like, the nature of their sex drive and their lust, and their craving for money, and etc., etc. So there is a lot of that that the censor sees. Likewise, there's also a lot of this wrought kind of work where there's more of an artificial construction of discourse and artifacts where everything is kind of at a distance. And so the censor is trying to do something distinct. And they assign the poem a different role. And so from record to relic to communion to ritual communion, we are getting closer and closer to essentially what is divine, or to what is sacred and real. And so radiance is the final piece of the puzzle there, where the scryers are those who are basically like the light of the sacred itself, and that's why we have to approach and absorb it in an anagogic way, where we're going into it and then back to absorb, and then going back into it and back out, and charting out the kind of back and forth pattern of assimilation that Plato talked about in the myth of the cave. So those, and so that's kind of like more of a direct, but even more of a direct, I think, capturing of and relating to the divine in that final stage. So what we have here, I've just tried to show you the clear icons. We've got the record at the top left, then we've got the relic, we've got the ritual communion, and then we've got the radiance. Okay, so this was a late addition that came to me, and so I'm just going to slot this into the PowerPoint, and hopefully it won't disrupt the sequence of this presentation. But what I wanted to do was essentially just clarify the movement and the shift from relic to living communion. So what I was just reflecting on after putting together the other parts of this presentation was that the relic, I think, actually captures the nature of how scholars relate to that which is sacred quite well, because a relic is like the saint's relic, or the relics of someone holy. It's it is it's a it's the body in which something holy once lived. And I think that captures the nature of how scholars relate to the sacred. To continue the metaphor, they utilize in their poetry, they think with, and their worldview is made out of the body of tradition. It's a relic of tradition. It's something that was once sacred, once initiated it, the Christ figures, the poet figures, the prophet figures. And so it's an essentially conservative way of relating to the sacred. It's off in a distance, and it is something that has been passed down, because relics do get passed down to the present day. And so it's still not a directly unmediated kind of relationship with the actually living body of something sacred and holy. And that's what the ritual communion, of course, is. It is something which you take into yourself, and it is a living body of Christ. And it's through that you enter into the wider life that he spoke about. So that, for me, is those two symbols, the relic and the ritual communion, show two very different ways of relating to the sacred. And then, of course, the light at the top of the hierarchy is just an extension of that. So where in the relic stage we get something that is akin to idol worship. It's on a continuum with it. The record is maybe, like in the sentimental stage, is probably what we would call an idol worship, because it's purely profane. The relic stage, I'm going to say, as I'll point out in the next slide, is still technically profane in the way that it doesn't have a direct relationship with the sacred, which is, of course, why so many scholars or priests who relate in this conservative way to the sacred can do all kinds of things in their daily practice which actually desecrate it, interestingly enough. So it's not quite the same, though. I mean, having said that, it's not quite the same as the idol worship of like sentimental personal expression, because it's not purely profane, but it's still profane enough that we can draw a connection there. And then that shifts over the halfway point into the icon, which is what the poem as ritual communion is. It's that which holds the light of something greater. And then that is on a continuum itself with the radiance at the top stage, which is an even more direct relationship with something. It's sort of like the light itself. And in Blake's terminology, Blake talks about how we need to communicate that light. He says true art is allegory addressed to the intellectual powers, which is denied to the corporeal understanding. So it's almost given, it's quite a pure icon, and it's not allowing any other ways of it's not allowing the form to get in the way of that. But I think this kind of art doesn't have to be like that. That's Blake's unique approach. Whatever it is, it's just that and that's why it's a bit of an anagogic relation. But I'm sure I spoke about that in my previous slide. So the main thing I just wanted to capture in this slide was that shift from relic to ritual communion, and just to elaborate that a little more. So why swear? Well, I think swear is it's an interesting word. It actually has a double meaning to it, obviously. So to swear can mean something that is profane, and that I think captures the spirit of what lower poetry can be, the sentimental types, to some extent, even the scholarly, although that depends, because I would argue that it's profane in the way that even when utilizing the materials of sacred traditions, it's still doing so from a distance. Though it doesn't know that, it's still frozen, ossified, and systematized it in a way that doesn't have enough of the real living essence of it. And so even when it is Christian, explicitly Christian poetry at the scholarly level, there's still something that the censor and the scryer would recognize as profane in it. And to swear also means to commit oneself to something in relation to that which is sacred. So you would swear to stand by someone in sickness or in health, and that's under the eyes of God, or your country, or whatever it is, the law. You're conducting yourself in relation to that which is sacred, and that's what I think higher poetry does. It is in relation. It is in a more real, living relation, a more direct relation to that. So it's a interesting double word that I think does justice to the meta-poetics that this ladder of poetry is essentially trying to create. It is trying to be a meta-poetics, in other words, that does justice to the lower rungs of poetry, the lower down on the stage of development, and the higher up. So what we're doing is we're trying to create a metapoetic framework that attempts to encapsulate different smaller poetics and schools of thought into an overarching system. Why are we trying to do this? Because we want to broaden and deepen our shared language as a poetry community, and we want to embed and disseminate this kind of understanding of the larger whole in the poetry community, and also of the sacred. Why? Because we want to try and build a kind of commons, a shared ground that has available a number of different entry points for different poets to be able to enter into and be encouraged and helped to develop along their own unique lines, rather than everything being funneled into a system where the scholar and the scholarly wrought kind of work is just assumed to be the apotheosis, the top of the line. Because and also, by extension, what I'm trying to point out here is that we want to a language and an understanding that can ultimately help these younger poets, or these poets working along lines with a more direct relationship to the sacred, to not be subjected to the forcible reductions of the scholars, in which they are forced into a line that isn't actually their own. And that is something that scholars who are identified with their status as at the top of this, at the apex of this hierarchy, can be guilty of. And that is something we have to, I think, as a community, eventually, we have to wrestle with the damage that has been done because of that. Just simply because the meta-poetic, the meta-theoretic apparatus hasn't been encompassing enough behind the establishment of poetry. It's been left implicit and fragmented, and it needs to be made explicit and synthetic, which is what this swear ladder of poetry is trying to do. So as I said, so that we can become more aware of potential pitfalls and opportunities collectively, and again, so that we can enrich the creation of our own poetry along lines that may be quite distinct and may not have as many people to read and support us with or help us with if we are along other lines, like the senses. The scryers presumably don't need much in the way of help. They are as developed as we can sense them to be. But it also helps us to engage with others, I think, and just like learn to see what line they're working upon. It would be inappropriate for a scholar to try to, I think, force the censor or the scryer into a kind of formal polish that desecrates the living essence of what they're trying to communicate. And that was more or less what happened to Shakespeare at the beginning of his career. I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe it was a certain Thomas Peacock who called Shakespeare a young upstart crow because he wasn't following all the expected requirements and conventions of the stage drama, because he was there was a lot of things that he was doing that were just that only makes sense if you see his work as the necessary reflection of the vision that he was trying to communicate. Likewise, it wouldn't be appropriate for a censor to try to help the sentimental type to communicate something that's spiritually more direct, because that's not where the sentimental type is at. The sentimental type is more at a level of development where they are primarily preoccupied with the personal emotions and self-expression. And so it's probably going to be more within their reach to start to move into the scholarly and start to take a little bit of care and discipline around the form that they're capturing, so as to start to speak to something a little bit more universal in the scholarly sense, because there are deeper meanings of the word universal, and each stage is going to relate to that a little bit differently, but it's moving out of the self into the conventional self, into like the conventional sort of worldview as such of society. And what the sentimental type may need or want at some point help with is learning the forms by which they can communicate that larger conventional common stock, to use a phrase I've seen in connection to poetry somewhere. And so likewise the scholar is the interesting one, because I think they and this actually brings me to the next slide, the potential criticisms. They are probably going to be the one that levels the, insofar as this gets any traction at all, they would be the ones most reluctant to accept this, because it means going from the top of the hierarchy to the middle of the hierarchy, and that's, no one wants to do that. And it just simply doesn't align with all of the poetic theorizing, both explicit and implicit, that they've been doing. And by implicit, I mean the projections that they've been making. So the criticism from such circles or quarters might be along the lines of, it is dangerous to put people in a developmental hierarchy. And as I've already said a couple of times throughout this whole series, we're actually already doing this, it's just in an unconscious way. And that's what scholars have been projecting onto the world at large. And the sentimental types tend to have an issue with this, and the senses have an issue with this as well. Only the senses are far fewer in number and have far less of a readership to make their concerns heard, known, and understood. So this swear framework is trying to make it, the developmental hierarchy, explicit. It's trying to do so in a way that does justice to the data and to the implicit ontology in all this, and also show how each rung has a social function that it fulfills. So they aren't all bad. They're all needed and necessary steps on the ladder of development. A connected criticism that I think scholars may have in particular is that they just don't know what I'm talking about with essence and vision. And if you're feeling that, there's a few things that I've tried to write down here to try and capture how I would respond to that criticism. The first is that they are larger realities than that which can be perceived and known through the concrete analytical mind alone. And so it takes time to be able to grow into sensing and seeing them. The simplest advice I could give to those who doubt this is to read Blake and get a sense of how alien and foreign he is. You're not going to understand him straight away, but that foreignness is an indicator that there's something else going on here. It's something that you haven't, it's a quality and an element that you haven't come into contact with before. And that is the most straightforward way I can think of giving you an experiential indicator of the thing I'm talking about. It's like light grows the eyeball by which to see it, and it's analogous to what I'm talking about here. We need to grow into being able to see the underlying patterns, the underlying essences from within and through direct perception that are there behind the material reality that we can concretely pick apart and analyze and track. Other than that, apart from Blake, listen to my discussions on essence of vision. But other than that, that would be my main response. I'm not really sure how else to help you. I can try to continue to draw on a few different philosophical arguments to do justice to what I'm getting at with essence. But this is something that Jung has spoken about with archetypes, and that there are these almost magnetic forces behind the material reality that are organizing them into certain structures. That's one way of getting at it. I think it's Henri Bergson who talks about the élan vital, like the life force, and he talks about intuition and connection to it. Again, these are concepts that thinkers have been talking about for a long time. That it's just that the scholars tend to dismiss this because they themselves can't sense it, because they're so separative in their concrete mind, and they haven't yet awakened the heart by which to sense the inside of these things. And a really good example of this is the scholars who dismissed in Newton. Newton wrote about gravity and levity as these two necessary opposing forces, and we have collectively accepted gravity and then dismissed levity. That is probably a good instance. Again, I don't know much about science at all. I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist. I'm just trying to articulate that there is a history of scholars simply dismissing what they themselves don't understand, and then erecting a whole worldview and framework and kind of mental mathematics designed around shutting out that which they don't understand. And another example of this in a more literary context, so something I'm a little bit more equipped to talk about, is it was a translation of Goethe's Faust that I read years and years ago, and it was essentially the translator just didn't include the second part of Faust, or only the first couple of scenes, and his rationale for it in the prologue, in his preamble, was that Goethe was just, it's not really that well understood or that relevant or that needed, and it's kind of a bit murky, and Goethe, he didn't really, I don't think the translator quite said this, but the implication was that Goethe, was just, it was lesser art. Goethe wasn't as successful in the second part of Faust, and so he just didn't include it. And I thought that was a prototypical scholarly move. That scholar didn't understand the second part of Faust, and couldn't sense what Goethe was trying to was envisioning and trying to capture, and so he just dismissed it. And so that's, and I'm not trying to, for the criticism implicit in these two criticisms, that I am trying to erect a system in which I'm above scholars. That's not the intention. The intention is not to a power move. The intention is to bring into a framework and into connection with other poetics, a contact with something that is more directly nutritious, and that's that. If we go back to the previous slide on the different purposes of poetry, and for the senses, they are trying to afford the reader an appropriation into the reader of the kind of nutritious wisdom or truth or living essence that the censor is trying to communicate. And that is something that is ultimately to the good, and I think deeply needed in our very materialistic and separative culture. And that's why, this as a poetics, it's a poetics. It concerns itself with poetry, but it also concerns itself with and tries to articulate the center of something that could be useful just for culture at large. it has applications to science and culture, and helps us in a way to understand religion in a potentially richer light, or more directly related light. It helps us to understand, or gives us a way into understanding some of what Jung was talking about and psychologists have spoken about. The ability through the heart to sense the living essence and reality of things is something that we need in our society. So that wraps up, I think, this portion of the series, the SWEAR acronym, and we'll see where we go from here. And thanks for listening. Let me know your thoughts if you have any.